for the first review back, we're taking a look at Khord's Power, a tight and technical gravity-based map sure to keep you engaged. To start off, I think this very first turn sets an excellent precedent for how the rest of the level is going to go, because it will likely take you a good few tries to get this transition down. There is some considerable time saved to be had just in this beginning transition, so I'm glad it's at the very start. For me, personally, it feels like the track lets off on the difficulty as you get further in. No one likes a diff spike at the end, and I have a reason to say that. Moving on, I can't help but mention how much I just adore this decoration. The environment uses so many different terrain shapes, layer by layer, really taking time to blend everything together so it's all cohesive. The road uses its own specific color separate from the surroundings, which makes navigating a breeze, even if it is quite technical in places. I like how the trees feel carefully placed and not just spammed around. The floating crystals fill the airspace just enough. The level is fairly vertical after all, so I'd say it's more important to have air deco in something like this than in a flatter track. I also want to mention how I love how only some of the crystals are tied together. Just that tiny detail is amazing, and I don't know why I love it so much, but I do. Oh, and the giant robots. Of course I love them. How could I not love them? I don't know what exactly it is about them, but they feel so alive and fit perfectly within this environment. And they're modeled super well, especially the lower one, with its bones and musculature in the arm. Just amazing building skills shown here. But alright, I do have some bad things to say here, so let's get on with it. Something you may have noticed during the gameplay is the fact that there are no guides or indicators for the checkpoints. I am unaware just how many players actually play with the force fields turned off, but they do exist and will probably be very confused when they reach the finish. I have seen creators in the past use the freer placement of the force fields to guide the player into setting up correctly, but usually they have a gate around them or the classic intangible neon green line that a lot of us use. I think they just need something. Another thing I'm not too into are the arrows. I really like their design, but they're not used very effectively. I don't know about you, but when I see an arrow on the road, I'm going to drive along with it, as I have been taught to by other tracks people have made. So when I see this, I read it as telling me to hang left and do a hard right turn, not enter into a wall ride. Okay, let's rapid fire some thoughts. This doesn't bother me personally, but knowing some people, this crystal is just too bright. It's a cool idea, but I can see people complaining about it. Going under the road after CP6 is pretty blind, in my opinion. If we pause here, you can see the road continuing on the other side, but that's only if you're specifically looking that far ahead. Otherwise, one could very easily assume it's a banked right turn and miss the little transition here. The banked S-bend right before CP8 has most of its shape lost as it's covered in shadow. Something I've found to help combat this is adding lines on either end of the S-bend, and the player should be able to infer from there. But that's all I have to say here. Overall, I really like this track, and the technical gameplay as well as the great decoration skills used to create the environment. With only a few readability issues, I think this deserves to be played quite a lot. It's clear there is a ton of effort and care put in here, and I applaud it. Good job, Khord.
The second map in this episode is MELTDOWN by zivecef, a ZSL shorty track with some tricky warrides and transitions. Alright, let's get into detail. The track layout itself is tricky in a sense that some of the pieces are not connected together, so they might require a bit of precision and practice to understand the approach for some of the transitions. I do have to say that they feel nice and smooth when done correctly. The map does get easier towards the middle and the end part, so at least you get past the worst part at the first couple seconds, right? The frequent checkpoint placements are a nice touch because it's always nice to keep track of your splits, in my opinion. The decoration is simple but good looking, but I also don't have too much else to say about it. The neon might be a little too much. I know a lot of people don't like the bloom of the neon, me included. Also, it looks more like an eruption than a meltdown, I think. That's most of the positives out of the way. Now, let's see some of the downsides. Once again, about the weather. As I said, I'm a bias for red, but in terms of playability, this is too much for me. The road texture being dark gray and black also doesn't help with seeing the exact path you need to take, and they blend in with the decoration colors quite well at some places. A lot of these might be graphics dependent, but considering the game has bloom and volumetric lights turned on by default, I do have to take this into consideration. The spinning and red lights might cause some visibility issues once again, when it shines in your face especially. They are however not as bad as the weather itself. There were attempts to guide the player to the right path with dotted lines on the first couple turns, but I'm not sure if they were enough. Alright, some extra notes I want to add. This being a ZSL submission, it should be competitive, user-friendly, and relatively easy to finish to most players, but I do think this map falls under not being user-friendly with the visuals overall. The flat to warite transfer right after checkpoint 1 can be very bumpy, but if you stay in the middle of it, it's consistent enough to not be a huge issue. The inner warite right after checkpoint 3 might look a bit daunting at first, but it's pretty easy to pull off. The tube section may require some oscillation before the turns, which can prove difficult to some players. Alright, my personal conclusion. Overall, the map plays fine with some practice, and I enjoy the layout because of how satisfying it is to get the transitions right. But the weather and colors are really pulling it back from being a great map to something that one would rather not play for more than a couple minutes just to keep their eyes intact. There is one solution one could make. Just turn off all metric lights. Trust me.
Next up, we have Rustmaw Ridge, with a prefix I would have dropped personally. This map, initially made for the ZSL contest themed around making a level with a set of pre-placed checkpoints, was rejected for moving set checkpoints. But aside from that, I find this level to be quite fun. It's fast, smooth, and the line gives enough breathing room for the more cautious players to still enjoy it. I'm really into this environment though. A large sense of scale is something I've always enjoyed in games, and these ruins surrounding the area achieve that perfectly for me. The factory area is even set in place nicely within the rocky terrain, adding just that much more to the believability of this world. Now, I gotta say I quite appreciate how the area you drive in is super distinct from everything else. It gives players an easier time navigating for sure. But navigating this might be tricky in sections, because there's quite a lot of mesh paint used in the level. As I've said many a time before, mesh is fine to use moderately, but once you go all out with it, the readability of the track goes down substantially. There are two key points to look at here. The first wall right after CP1, and the second, similarly shaped turnaround right before the end. The thing that sticks out to me the most are the road borders are mesh as well. You try cutting this corner without hitting that border. It's quite hard to see, and the slow turning of the camera does not help for your reaction time. A first person might have helped for this, but with the mesh there in the first place, it's just going to be too busy to see no matter what. Before we look at the second mesh area I mentioned earlier, I do want to point out that this transition out of the half loop does suffer from the mesh as well, and players unfamiliar with the road pieces used for it definitely have a chance of being confused or overwhelmed here. Anyways, the second mesh-induced area definitely needs a first person in my opinion, and it was so close to having it. Literally right before the transition, you go out of first person. To me, this is the exact kind of transition that needs first person. It's quick, upside down, and the third person camera doesn't fully allow you to see what you need to see. And once again, the road borders are also just mesh, very hard to see. But I've talked about mesh enough. I think we all get the idea by now. The last thing I have to mention is the Z fighting with the force fields. Usually this doesn't matter much in tracks, but in the already busy sections like this one, I can see it being quite distracting for some. The easiest fix is to scale the force field down very slightly with the Blueprint's X mod. Or in this case, for the ZSL rules, you can do the exact same thing the object the force field is fighting with. The scale difference is so small, it should make no difference to how the level plays, and in my opinion, cleaning up Z fighting like this just makes your level look cleaner overall. For me, this is a fun and simple track, with some very effective deco that really gets me in a good way. The visibility issues with mesh and camera switches do affect it somewhat, but I would still gladly play this. After getting used to the map for a bit, I think this works perfectly in lobbies for more competitive players. Unicorn Invasion of Dundee Remastered. There's no deja vu here. This is a remaster of a level we reviewed in a previous episode, using our feedback as the basis for the majority of changes. And if that isn't super cool to you, I guess you probably don't make these episodes. So instead of going over this level again like a normal review, I'm just going to rapid fire through all the changes and compare them to the original, letting you know my thoughts on each and every one. Let's get started. The road color in the beginning section was changed to be more distinct from its surroundings, allowing much easier reading of the tight banked corners. Along with that, a rock that was quite the nuisance in the original has been removed. Thank you. A complaint I had in the original was the long straight of AFK time on this bridge, so a broken piece and a plank to cross over was added to give this section some pizzazz. I think it works fine. Now, the inside of the first building you enter has the most substantial change of them all, made to be a nicer transition than before, but it still definitely has some issues, which I'll explain now. Entering at speed requires prior knowledge that you need to go immediately right, which could have been accomplished with a sign inside the building. Instead, the arrows here only tell you to go in the door, and you just have to crash here and know for next time. Something like this would have been nicer in my opinion. Additionally, the reaction time needed to go up this ramp and start turning left early enough to not smash into the ceiling just isn't there. Once again, a crash and learn for next time moment. And the exit hole in the wall is not even aligned with the ramp, meaning if you're too far to the right, you'll probably hit the side of it. And considering the transition in question, you very likely will be. But moving on, the landing ramp out of that transition had the feathers removed, which previously were a detriment to the flow and weren't needed. All good there. The wall ride right after was adjusted so the exit was nicer on the player, lining them properly with the upcoming jump, and there was even some guides added to the ramp, very nice. Dotted guide to the wall ride was replaced with the dashes seen on the ramp. I do like me some consistent guides, much appreciated. The booster before this drawbridge ramp was removed, as it previously gave the player way too much speed and you would overjump the entrance to the next area. The entrance to the jail and the jail itself was made a lot shallower, making for an easier transition, and it's also aligned with the tube section inside, so no more quick wiggles to get out of the way. And finally, previously you wouldn't realistically be able to see the risky finish until it was too late to go for it, so it was moved closer so the player can see it coming up the ramp. This change was super smart in my opinion. Okay, done. Overall, the level itself has indeed benefit from all these upgrades, and in my opinion is much nicer to play, even if I may miss some of the jank the old one had. One thing I will mention though, is it doesn't feel very tuned for faster players, as I did have some issues overjumping this landing and subsequently flying out of the wall ride, which is really hard to combat, hence why I'll share the thought that part of making playable maps is also being good at the game yourself. It becomes much easier to know the limits of players' speeds to avoid these kind of issues. Also, it took me way too long to find myself in this level, but I'm proud to say, I was struck by lightning.
Down to the Shops is a quaint, gravity-based track with long, sweeping turns and even some off-grid building. But make no mistake, this is no easy drive. This may even be the hardest track of the whole episode, because you just know we're never using our b****s. To expand on the thought a little bit, the track almost feels too fast for itself, like it wasn't designed for the speeds in mind. Most of these turns require a good amount of setting up correctly and precise smooth steering to get them perfect, or else you're just going to fly off the edge of the track. But to say that is an outright bad thing would be a mistake, because it is incredibly satisfying once you get that clean run from top to bottom. Finally, the level just clicks. Thankfully, if you do want to go slow, this level has nothing that would punish you for doing so. Aside from that, the deco is very indicative of simple but effective, as it provides just enough detail for the level to feel immersive, and yet not be distracting while racing. Even the sun's positioning, intended or not, lets itself stay out of the way of the direct vision of the player, at least until the very end. This does mean that the majority of the track is cloaked in shadow, but all road pieces are relatively simple enough that it shouldn't be a problem for visibility. As is the nature with gravity-based maps, it is important to be mindful of any possible wall rides, as letting the player get more speed than intended may break your map in unintended ways. Even if they aren't actually faster for the specific level, it's something to keep in mind and check for when building maps. One small thing to add is that the placement and shapes of the checkpoints makes them really tempting to try to enter wall rides within the circle structures around the banks. They are 100% not faster though, nor do they let you keep your speed after exiting them. The final thing to mention is about the finish. It's a really cool idea, ending the level at the bike racks in front of the shops, but while thematically fitting, they fail to stand out enough against the busy deco they occlude. And, as always, anyone without force fields would have no clue where the finish is. Again, unsure of how many this actually affects, but it is something to keep in mind as a mapper. Overall, this is a fun, but definitely tough track. Any lobby that encounters this level will surely have a competitive leaderboard. It's just that tempting to get a clean run on this level. Good job, DeeDee. You've successfully made something I think all top players can really get into.
For the final review, we have the Day area, a deceivingly complex track that utilizes the off-grid build style to the max. Off-grid building is quite difficult to do correctly, but it can get you some really unique results. But to start off, I think this track is pretty fun. I've played it more than enough in free play already. It's technical in the sense that it's played differently from most tracks, but it feels so doable. Now, there isn't much to say about the deco, but it works fine for me. the idea is cool. Although, I guess I will mention, the gold and orange parts feel like they come out of nowhere, and don't really fit with the established decoration, but I can appreciate some abstract deco just because it looks cool. Something that does stick out to me though is the paints used for the track. There's very little contrast between the 2 yellow paints used, and in some cases make areas blend into mush, losing their shape. The most substantial of those cases probably being the transition to this tube at the start. The edge of it is lost in the fact it's all in shadow, and of course using the same paint. The dots used for the guides on the landing though do help to combat this somewhat. This corner after CP3 can be a little confusing on your first try, as it uses overlapping pieces to create a different shape. Due to the nature of this transition, it can take a few tries to figure out how to do it cleanly. And harkening back to the similar yellow paints, it would have helped to have a more contrasting color to show these pieces in my opinion. Now, you may have noticed it already, but there's a pretty major flaw this track suffers from. It appears to not have used the Vertex Snapper mod. You can tell just by the fact each piece isn't perfectly aligned and are often clipping slightly into each other. What the mod in question does is let you drag pieces by their vertices to the same position on a separate object, like so. From my extensive time testing this level, there is no Unity weirdness with overlapping pieces. But I can tell you for sure that if you're making a level like this, that mod saves you so much time. I've done this kind of thing manually before, and it's extremely finicky. The Vertex Snapper mod has just become an essential part of building tracks for me, and I highly recommend it if you want to make more unique tracks off-grid. But overall, I do genuinely find this track fun to play after I spent some time to learn it. The mix of smooth and kinda jank parts makes this interesting to drive. I will, however, stick by the opinion that a map in this style would probably be more fun to play for a general audience if transitions between pieces were made smoother. And that was the last review. Thank you for watching this episode of ZMR. I hope you enjoyed. Remember to join the Discord in the description below to submit your maps for review in an upcoming episode. I've been Linzi, and I'll see ya.